In a world stained by silence and shackled by centuries of injustice, a baby's first cry echoed through a modest home in Atlanta, Georgia, on January 15, 1929. That cry belonged to Martin Luther King Jr., the son of a preacher and the grandson of a slave. But he did not arrive in a world that welcomed him equally. Long before he took his first steps, before he found his voice or held a Bible, the world around him had already drawn lines he would be forbidden to cross. He was born into a country that claimed liberty, yet denied dignity to those who looked like him. But fate, as it often does, had different plans. In the stillness of that night, no one could have known that the child resting in his mother's arms would one day awaken a sleeping nation. Martin's early life was not filled with luxury or grand declarations. He was raised in the sweet Auburn neighborhood of Atlanta, where faith and oppression walked hand in hand. His father, Martin Luther King Sr., was a Baptist minister, fiery in the pulpit, unyielding in his convictions, and a pillar of the community. His mother, Alberta Williams King, was a teacher, warm and resolute, who sowed seeds of purpose into her son's heart. Their home was filled with the gospel, thick with the scent of hope, and shadowed by the knowledge that to be Black in America was to walk a narrow path carved by others. Martin grew up with books in his hands, sermons in his ears, and racism in his backyard. As a child, he was brilliant, curious, and unusually observant. But he was also marked by pain too complex for his young heart to comprehend. One of his earliest wounds came when two white playmates, his closest friends, were told by their parents they could no longer play with him because he was Black. He did not understand the cruelty, only the sudden silence. That heartbreak planted something deep within him, a quiet yearning, a righteous discontent. It was the first time the dream of brotherhood was shattered in his soul, but not broken. The church was Martin's sanctuary. It was there that he first felt the power of words. His father's voice thundered with authority. The choir sang like angels defying gravity. Church wasn't just religion, it was resilience. It was where Black souls gathered not just to worship, but to weep, to organize, to survive. Every Sunday, Martin watched as the pulpit became a battleground for justice. The rhythm of the sermon, the swell of conviction, it all entered him like breath. He began to believe that words, when lifted by truth, could change the course of human history. But as Martin grew, so did the walls around him. Georgia was not kind to dreamers who dared to be Black. The signs were everywhere. Whites only and colored entrance, reminders that even your dignity had a separate door. When Martin was just a teenager, he watched as his father was humiliated in public by a white police officer who called him boy. But his father looked that man in the eye and said, "I'm a man and my name is Martin Luther King." That moment carved itself into Martin's bones. Dignity, he learned, was not given, it was demanded. By the time Martin reached high school, he was already questioning everything. Segregation, injustice, even faith itself. He read voraciously Plato, Aristotle, Tolstoy, Gandhi, his mind hungry for answers. He graduated from high school at 15 and entered Morehouse College, the same school his father and grandfather attended. There, under the mentorship of Dr. Benjamin Mays, Martin began to truly wrestle with his calling. Mays challenged him to think beyond the pulpit, to see the fight for justice as sacred work. The pulpit was no longer just a place to preach, it was a platform to protest. But this journey was never without doubt. There were nights when Martin felt torn between the safety of silence and the sacrifice of speaking out. He was drawn to philosophy, to law, to the idea of changing systems from within. But ultimately, the ministry called to him, not because it was easy, but because it was right. He knew the gospel was more than salvation, it was revolution. At Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, he refined his voice. At Boston University, where he earned his doctorate, he married intellect with fire. And in the quiet between classes, he fell in love with Coretta Scott, a woman who matched his passion and strengthened his resolve. Coretta was not just his wife. She was his partner in every sense. A classically trained singer, a thinker, an activist. She believed in the dream even before it had a stage. Their marriage was a union of vision and purpose. In their tiny home, with little money and heavy hearts, they spoke of the world not as it was, but as it could be. She believed in him when he doubted himself, and in her faith, he found strength. By the time Martin accepted his first pastoral role at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, he was no longer just a preacher. He was a man prepared to challenge an empire of injustice. And fate was waiting for him, just around the corner, in the form of a tired black woman named Rosa Parks who, by refusing to give up her seat, would light a fire that would consume the nation. But that moment, the Montgomery bus boycott, was still to come. For now, Martin stood at the threshold of history, his feet planted in the soil of the South, his voice untested, his dreams still unspoken. But deep within him burned a fire, the fire of a child who had once been told he was less, who had seen his father stand tall, who had read of Gandhi's peace and dreamed of justice. He didn't know it yet, but the world was about to know his name. Montgomery in the 1950s was like many southern cities, polite on the surface, poisonous underneath. The sidewalks were shared, but the rights were not. Black men and women could build the cities, clean the homes, serve in wars, but they could not sit beside a white man on a bus. The wound of racism wasn't just visible, it was institutionalized, legalized, and weaponized. But still, black families prayed, worked, endured, hoping for something better for their children, for a day when skin would no longer dictate destiny. When Martin and Coretta arrived in Montgomery, they were young, hopeful, and unaware of just how quickly history would place its weight on their shoulders. Martin took to the pulpit at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church with humility, unaware that within months, that very church would become the nerve center of a movement. His sermons were rich with theology, but laced with subtle defiance. He preached about love, but his voice trembled with a justice that refused to sleep. Then, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, weary from a lifetime of injustice, refused to move from her seat on a city bus. That single act of quiet defiance would send a shockwave through Montgomery and into the bloodstream of America. She was arrested. The community was enraged. The moment needed a voice, and all eyes turned toward the young preacher with a doctorate degree and the burning spirit. Martin had not planned to lead a revolution. He had simply wanted to serve his church, raise his children, live a life of purpose. But the universe does not ask for permission. It chooses its vessels, and it had chosen him. That night, in a small gathering of Montgomery's black leaders, Martin was asked to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association, to organize and guide a citywide bus boycott. His hands trembled, his voice shook, but he said yes. That yes changed everything. The boycott began, not with fanfare, but with aching feet. Thousands of black citizens walked to work, school, church, miles every day, refusing to ride the buses that treated them as less than human. It was a protest not of fists, but of footsteps. For over a year they marched, and through every speech, every meeting, every newspaper headline, Martin's voice began to rise, not just as a preacher, but as a prophet. But the cost was steep. Within weeks, Martin received his first death threat. Then another, and another. They came by phone, by letter, even through broken windows in the dead of night. One night, while he was away speaking, Coretta and their baby girl barely escaped a bomb that tore through their front porch. When Martin rushed home and saw the smoke rising from his house, the same home where he had dreamed, prayed, and held his newborn, something in him cracked. He stood before the angry crowd that had gathered with guns and fury, ready to fight back. But Martin raised his hand and said, "He who lives by the sword will perish by the sword. We must love our enemies." His words fell over them like rain, calming, impossible, divine. That night, Martin didn't just become a leader. He became a moral compass. And yet, behind the speeches, behind the cameras, Martin suffered. There were nights he sat at his kitchen table alone, hands folded, eyes shut, trembling not from fear, but from the weight of it all. The threats, the hate, the pressure to be a father, a husband, and a symbol. He was 26 years old, and already felt like he had lived lifetimes. One night, after yet another threat had left his soul gasping, he bowed his head and prayed, "Lord, I am at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I can't face this alone." And in the silence that followed, he felt something stir, not the voice of thunder, but a whisper of peace, telling him, "Stand up for righteousness. Stand up for truth. I will be with you." From that night on, he was never the same. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days. It crippled the city's transit system. It shattered the illusion that the oppressed would stay silent forever. And in December of 1956, the Supreme Court ruled segregation on public buses unconstitutional. Victory had come, not through violence, but through perseverance. Martin was no longer just a local pastor. He was a national figure. The cameras followed him now. Journalists quoted him. And Black Americans across the South, from Alabama to Mississippi, from Georgia to Tennessee, began to believe that change was not just possible, but inevitable. But Martin was not driven by fame. He was driven by calling. He saw injustice not as a Southern issue, but an American sin. And he knew the road ahead would be long. He did not seek the spotlight, but he understood its power. So he kept speaking, marching, writing, lighting a path others could follow. And behind him, Coretta walked, graceful, steady, bearing the same burdens without complaint. When their second child was born, she cradled the baby while Martin stood before crowds of 10,000. When the hate mail came, she burned the letters. When fear knocked, she stood taller. Her courage was silent, but unshakable. They were not chasing glory. They were holding hands at the edge of the impossible. The victory in Montgomery was like sunlight after a long, bitter winter. It warmed the spirits of those who had walked until their feet bled. It gave the oppressed their first real taste of justice. And yet, for Martin, it was not a destination. It was only the beginning. Segregation still gripped schools, restaurants, voting booths, even water fountains. The movement had only pried open one rusted lock. The entire prison of racial hatred still stood tall. Martin knew the backlash would come. For every court ruling, there would be new laws written in shadows. For every protest, there would be dogs, fire hoses, and batons. And for every speech he gave, there would be new threats. Some whispered, some screamed from truck windows as they sped by his home. He had become both symbol and target, savior and enemy, depending on who you asked. But he never let his heart harden. He never let hate in. Instead, he leaned into the pain, used it like fuel. From Montgomery, he began to travel across the South, forming alliances, giving sermons that didn't just inspire the congregation, they lit fires inside tired hearts. In Birmingham, in Albany, in Jackson, he preached love in a land that taught hate. He preached nonviolence in cities where police didn't blink before cracking a skull. He walked into churches still smelling of smoke and told people not to fear. And they believed him. But every mile he traveled took its toll. Martin was only in his late 20s, but he carried the exhaustion of a man twice his age. The hours were brutal. The schedule never stopped. There were rallies to lead, letters to answer, and funerals to attend. Sometimes he barely saw Coretta or his children. Sometimes he spoke with tears in his throat because the pain of watching black boys buried for crimes they didn't commit, that pain was too heavy to hide behind podiums. He had seen Emmett Till's face. He had seen the broken bones of children beaten by police. And sometimes he looked into the mirror and wondered, can I really keep going? Still, the world was beginning to listen. In 1957, just a year after the boycott, he founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, a network of churches and ministers who shared a dream of equality and dignity. The SCLC became the heartbeat of the civil rights movement, and Martin became its voice. He spoke in gymnasiums, at church altars, on courthouse steps, wherever people gathered to hope. And everywhere he went, his message was the same: love, peace, resistance, not through bullets, but through belief. But belief, as powerful as it is, could not shield him from sorrow. There were days Martin came home and collapsed into silence, eyes wide open but seeing nothing. There were nights when the fear wouldn't let him sleep. The weight of knowing that one wrong move, one wrong word, could bring death to those he loved most was an invisible hand around his throat. He never told the world how deeply it hurt. He just smiled in public and wept in private. And then came Atlanta, his hometown, the place where he once ran as a boy through the narrow streets, full of wonder. Now he returned as a man, as a symbol, and the city didn't know how to receive him. He was both its pride and its shame. Some black leaders feared he was pushing too hard, too fast. White officials labeled him a troublemaker and tried to silence his rise. But Martin never needed permission to tell the truth. And so, standing before thousands, he spoke words that pierced even the hardest hearts. We are not wrong. If we are wrong, then God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, then justice is a lie. But we are not wrong. We are American and we are human. That speech became a turning point. The crowds grew. The press followed. The world began to see what was happening in the American South. The television cameras showed blood on church steps, women dragged by their hair, children arrested for simply marching. And suddenly, Martin wasn't just speaking to Black Americans. He was speaking to the conscience of a nation. But not all would listen. In 1958, while signing copies of his book, Stride Toward Freedom, in a Harlem department store, a woman stabbed Martin in the chest with a steel letter opener. The blade came inches from his heart. For hours, doctors fought to save his life. When he woke in the hospital, he thanked God not for surviving, but for another chance to serve. And when reporters asked him what he thought of the woman who tried to kill him, he simply said, "I bear no ill will." The press called it divine. His followers called it miraculous. But Martin knew the truth. The attack was only a preview of the battles yet to come. Still, he healed. He returned to the movement. Because how could he rest, knowing that somewhere a child was still drinking from a fountain marked colored? How could he relax, knowing that Black veterans returned from war only to be lynched in their uniforms? How could he stop when even the law bent against the weight of Black voices? No, Martin was not done. In fact, he was only just beginning. The stage was set. The country was watching. The movement had grown from a local protest to a national reckoning. And at the center stood a man, not perfect, not invincible, but unwavering in his belief that love could conquer the ugliest hate. Martin Luther King Jr. had stepped out of Montgomery and into history. His name was now etched into the story of America, not as a footnote, but as a chapter title. Part 1. Footsteps on Fire, 1959 to 1961. By 1959, Martin Luther King Jr. was no longer just a preacher from Montgomery. He had become the drum major for justice, a man whose very presence could stir crowds and terrify power. But fame was not a throne, it was a cross. The more visible he became, the more dangerous his mission grew. The more the nation looked up to him, the more dark forces plotted to bring him down. Still, he pressed forward. That same year, Martin made a journey that many had forgotten he ever took, a pilgrimage to India, the land of Gandhi, the prophet of nonviolence. Martin had studied his teachings for years, but now he stood where Gandhi once stood, breathed the air he breathed, and walked the roads where millions once defied the British Empire without lifting a fist. The journey shook him. It reminded him that nonviolence was not just a tactic, it was a way of life, a fire that burned inside the soul. When he returned to America, he carried India in his heart and a deeper clarity in his mission. The SCLC began to train young people not just how to march, but how to resist without hate. They practiced getting arrested. They practiced not striking back when insulted. They prepared to be spat on, beaten, cursed, and jailed, and still smile, still sing, still pray for their enemies. It wasn't weakness. It was the strongest thing a human heart could do. Then came the Freedom Riders. In 1961, brave students, black and white, boarded buses across the South to challenge segregation in interstate travel. They rode into the belly of hatred, where mobs awaited them with iron pipes and flaming crosses. And while the world watched them bleed, Martin was torn. He supported their courage, but struggled with their recklessness. He worried that without discipline, without structure, the movement would collapse under chaos. But he also knew the truth. Courage can't wait. The young were no longer asking permission. They were demanding freedom with blistered feet and scorched skin. And so he joined them, not on the buses, but in spirit, in speeches, in courtrooms. Every headline they earned made the walls of Jim Crow crack a little more. Every arrest revealed the brutality behind the smiling mask of the South. But the cost was rising. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, had turned Martin into a marked man. He was labeled a threat, a subversive, an agitator. They bugged his phones, followed his family, tapped his hotel rooms. They wanted dirt. They wanted shame. They wanted silence. But all they found was a man too stubborn to quit, too faithful to fold. Then came Albany. In 1961, the SCLC turned its attention to Albany, Georgia, a city where segregation still wore a badge. Martin hoped for a dramatic showdown, a clear victory. But Albany's officials were clever. They avoided the spectacle. No dogs. No hoses. Just quiet arrests. And so, Martin sat in jail for days while the cameras waited for violence that never came. Albany was a disappointment. A lesson. He had underestimated the strategy of the enemy. But failure didn't destroy him. It refined him. The next fight would be different. The year was 1963, a year that would burn itself into American history like fire onto parchment. Martin turned his eyes toward Birmingham, Alabama, the most segregated city in America. A place where bombs planted by racists were so frequent, the locals had begun calling it Birmingham. Here, Martin would not play it safe. With the SCLC and local activists, he launched a campaign of sit-ins, boycotts, and peaceful marches. They knew the police chief, Eugene Bull Connor, would react with violence. And that's exactly what they wanted. Because sometimes the only way to reveal evil is to provoke it. The arrests came fast. Martin was thrown into jail again, but this time, he was not alone. This time, the entire nation was watching. And from the darkness of his cell, he picked up a pen and scratched out what would become one of the most powerful pieces of writing in American history. Letter from a Birmingham jail. He wrote to fellow clergymen who had accused him of being too impatient, too radical. In that letter, he answered with fire. For years now I have heard the word, wait. It rings in the ear of every Negro with piercing familiarity. This wait has almost always meant never. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Those words echoed through pulpits and parliaments. They shook hearts, tore through excuses, and planted seeds in the minds of people who had never known such pain. It wasn't just a letter, it was a sermon to a sleeping nation. And then the world saw the hoses. Television screens across America flickered with black and white images of children being knocked down by water cannons, of dogs lunging at teenagers, of police dragging little girls in Sunday dresses into paddy wagons. These were not criminals, they were babies. They were dreamers. They were America's own, and yet the system treated them like enemies of the state. The world gasped. Suddenly, people who had ignored the headlines could no longer ignore the horror. Birmingham had become the beating heart of a movement, and its screams could be heard in the White House. Martin had done what he always knew he must do. He had exposed America's soul, the rot and the beauty, side by side. And the next step would take him to the Capitol. 1963 had already been soaked in tears and blood, but it had not yet been defined. That would change in one blazing afternoon, a day when hope stood taller than hate, when a preacher from Atlanta turned the steps of the Lincoln Memorial into a pulpit for the soul of a nation. But before that day arrived, storm clouds gathered. Tensions inside the movement were growing. Some activists thought King was too patient. Others thought the system would never listen without violence. Young leaders like Malcolm X were speaking openly about self-defense and revolution. The country was dividing not just along racial lines, but within the very movement itself. Was it too late for peace? Martin didn't believe so. He believed the movement could still awaken America's conscience without burning it down. But he knew time was running out. And so, a dream began to form. Not just his dream, but a collective cry. Let's go to Washington. And so they did. August 28th, 1963. A day when the earth beneath the Capitol trembled, not from violence, but from footsteps. Over 250,000 people, black, white, old, young, Christians, Jews, atheists, union workers, teachers, veterans, mothers with strollers, teenagers with signs, all stood shoulder to shoulder under the burning sun, demanding one thing: jobs and freedom. It was called the March on Washington, and it was unlike anything the country had ever seen. Martin was not the only speaker that day. John Lewis, only 23 years old, gave a fiery warning to the government. Mahalia Jackson, the gospel queen, sang with thunder in her lungs. And as Martin approached the podium, something changed. He had a prepared speech, a good one, but it wasn't enough. Not for this moment. Not for this crowd. As he spoke, the words were strong, but rehearsed. Then, from behind him, Mahalia Jackson shouted, "Tell em about the dream, Martin. Tell em about the dream." And just like that, the paper in his hands became irrelevant. Martin looked out over the sea of faces, people standing on tiptoe, some crying, some silent, all hungry for more. And from the deepest part of his spirit, he began to speak what had been living in his heart all along. "I have a dream." The words rolled out like thunder and rain. That one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. The crowd erupted. Some wept. Others prayed. The world stopped. The words, unplanned and unscripted, became immortal. It wasn't just a speech. It was a prophecy. For 17 minutes, Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't just a man. He was a mirror showing America what it could be if it dared to believe. A poet, a preacher, a warrior without a sword. And when he finished, the applause didn't feel like noise. It felt like a heartbeat. 250,000 people roared. And across the ocean, nations watched in awe. The man who once sat alone in a Birmingham jail now stood as the voice of a generation. But even as hope soared, danger crept closer. Just weeks later, 4 little girls would be killed in a Birmingham church by a white supremacist bomb. Their names were Addie Mae Collins, Cynthia Wesley, Carol Robertson, and Denise McNair, children whose only crime was worshiping while black. Martin attended the funeral, grief hollowing his face. He did not scream. He did not burn buildings. He simply wept and then kept marching, because he knew their blood must not be wasted. Their dreams must not die. The dream must live. And so he kept going. The world had heard his dream, and for a brief moment it listened. In 1964, the U.S. government passed the Civil Rights Act, outlawing segregation in public places and banning employment discrimination. A year later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 followed, finally protecting the most basic right of democracy for Black Americans. For this, Martin Luther King Jr. was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, the youngest person ever at that time to receive it. But peace, it turned out, was not enough to save him. Selma, Alabama, 1965. The cameras were rolling when peaceful protesters tried to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge. What came next was horror. Mounted police beating unarmed citizens with clubs, tear gas choking the air, and the earth painted red with the blood of innocents. America watched in shock. Martin led the march again, this time with federal protection. And this time they made it. From Selma to Montgomery, Miles walked in dignity, pain, and prayer. But something inside Martin began to shift. The racism wasn't just in the South, it was everywhere. In Chicago, he faced jeering mobs and rocks thrown at his head. In the North, he saw poverty choking both Black and white communities. He realized civil rights wasn't just about skin color, it was about economic justice. He began to speak out against all injustice, poverty, inequality, militarism. And most dangerously of all, he spoke against the Vietnam War. The bombs in Vietnam explode at home, he said. They destroy the hopes of the poor in America. He was no longer just the voice of Black America. He was now a voice against the system itself. And for that, many turned on him. Former allies walked away. Politicians who once praised him called him a traitor. The FBI labeled him the most dangerous man in America. They wiretapped his phones, threatened him, tried to blackmail him into silence. But he would not be silenced. Instead, he launched what he called the Poor People's Campaign, a multiracial movement to demand housing, jobs, and dignity for all. 1968. Martin went to Memphis, Tennessee, to support a strike by Black sanitation workers. They were protesting dangerous conditions, unfair wages, and the fact that their lives seemed to matter less than garbage trucks. They carried signs that said, simply, "I am a man." Martin stood with them, but the air was heavy. Friends said he looked tired, even haunted. He had been threatened before, but this felt different. That night, he stood at the pulpit of the Mason Temple and delivered what would become his final sermon. "We've got some difficult days ahead, but it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Those were his last public words. The next evening, April 4th, 1968, as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, laughing with friends, a single bullet tore through the sky, and silence fell on the world. He was 39 years old.
He did not see the promised land.
But because of him, millions could begin to imagine it. Martin Luther King Jr. was not a perfect man. He doubted. He suffered. He feared. But he never surrendered to hate. And in a world addicted to violence, he proved that courage could come without a gun, that peace could be as loud as war. He left behind no throne, no riches, no army, only a voice. And that voice still echoes today, in classrooms, in protests, in hearts that refuse to bow to injustice. Because the dream did not die with him. It lives on. Every time we choose love over hate, justice over comfort, action over silence. Martin had a dream. Now it's ours to carry.